Hello, and welcome to No Net Loss in a Changing Landscape, the second session in the web forum series, Land Use 2021, A Place for Biodiversity Offsets, brought to you by the Alberta Land Institute. The Alberta Land Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and nonprofit land use policy research institute based at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. My name is Dave Poulton, and I'm the director of the Institute. I'll be your moderator for today's session. You can learn more about us by visiting the LI Expo booth. The Expo booth is on the left side of your screen if you're on a computer. You can also access materials relevant to today's presentation in the Expo area. We respectfully acknowledge that we at the University of Alberta are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. We have a very broad and diverse representation among our participants today. We welcome all of you from all parts of the globe. Special greetings and Ramadan Mubarak to everyone observing the holiest month of the Muslim calendar. Today's session is entitled No Net Loss in a Changing Landscape. Offsetting at its essence requires the weighing of environmental gains against environmental losses. But what kinds of gains are legitimately counted, and against what do we measure losses and gains? These questions touch on the complex issues of additionality and equivalency, which require us to project ecological futures in different scenarios. That is a challenging process in the simplest circumstances, and it becomes much more complicated matter, however, when we consider that ecosystems are constantly changing, either as a result of natural or human forces, including climate change. Now let me turn to today's speakers. Their biographies are located below this stage screen, so I will keep my introduction short. Today we welcome Fabien Quétier, Technical Director on No Net Loss and Net Gain Solutions for Biotope, an environmental consulting firm based in France. Also joining us from France is Florence Damiens. Florence is a PhD candidate and CS research officer at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Eric Higgs is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia. His research focus is on ecological restoration and how we intervene responsibly in changing ecosystems. And to lead today's session, we are pleased to welcome Marian Weber, Chief Environmental Economist for the British Columbia Ministry of Environment, and a researcher who has contributed to many offset plans and policies in Western Canada. Marian, please join us, and I'll turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Dave. So first of all, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the Lekwungen territory from Victoria, BC. And today's session is about no net loss. So I'm going to try and set up the remaining panelists and ask some questions about no net loss. So the title of this session, Just a Buzzword, comes from a paper that was co-authored by our next speaker, Fabien. And I think that what we really want to explore is what do we mean by no net loss? And if it is just a buzzword, how can we make no net loss have teeth in real policy? So I thought that I would give a little bit of an overview of where the ideas of no net loss originated. So although the American wetland policy is not the first time that the term no net loss was used, the wetland policy actually sets up many of the principles that we continue to use in offsetting today and that remain controversial in attaining no net loss or net gain benefits from offsets. So no net loss was mentioned in a 1988 paper that came from the US National Wetland Policy Forum, which convened in 1987 at the request of the EPA. And the EPA had asked the forum to address policy concerns about how the nation should manage its wetlands in the face of continued wetland loss. So this paper that came out in 1988 recommends establishment of a wetlands protection policy to achieve overall no net loss of the nation's wetlands defined by acreage and function, and to restore and create wetlands to increase the quality and quantity of the nation's wetland resource base. Continuing on, one of the members of the forum provided some insight into the no net loss goal. If realistically there is going to be some net loss, then what do you do? The no net loss goal is based on the principle that losses should be balanced. If loss is not acceptable, then we have to do something to make up for it. As a last resort, to create a wetland where there was none before. And so I want to draw you to, I think, two key and contentious areas of no net loss policy, which we continue to grapple with today. So the first is the idea of no net loss of area and function, and how we think about our sites and the functions they provide over time. And the second is the idea that we do accept continued loss in the face of the need to provide material benefits required for sustenance or habitation of humans, and we balance that with restoration. And so the role of restoration, wetland protection, and restoration of loss of function and area are ideas that we will continue to grapple with through the rest of this session. Unfortunately, most recent empirical evaluations of wetland and other offset policies find that offsets have been a policy failure. So this example is from Canada's no net loss policy for fish habitat, and a recent evaluation in 2006 found that 63% of the offset sites reviewed resulted in net loss of available habitat for fish populations, or the functionality of that habitat. 25% of the sites achieved no net loss, and 12% achieved net gain. And in brackets on the side, you can see the mitigation ratios that were applied to these offsets. So for the net loss sites, the average mitigation ratio was 0.7 to 1. And for the sites that achieved net gain, the average mitigation ratio was 4.8 to 1. Overall, this paper found that there's limited ability to replace functions in these sites. And I think that it would be safe to say that most empirical reviews of offsets and of restoration sites compared to historic condition find that the same results. It's very difficult to replace functions. So some of the implementation challenges that we need to address are restoration failure. For particular sites, we don't know that our restoration actions will be success. Some of the science around restoration is still developing. We have a lot of scientific uncertainty, both in terms of what does restoration provide over time in terms of benefits, but also what are the impacts of our losses on overall biodiversity at a landscape scale. And this speaks to how we combine restoration and avoided loss so that we get the outcomes that we desire over time. We have to be, I think, cognizant and more specific about the time lags to achieve objectives. So in the past, we've had, I think, rather simplistic debates about the benefits of avoided loss and paying people to not destroy pristine habitat compared to crediting restoration actions. And I think what we need to do is be more explicit about the biodiversity benefits that are provided by the different sites over time. We also have lack of follow-up and poor implementation. And our second speaker, Florence, will talk to some of the institutional issues that lead to poor implementation. Non-compliance is one of the main reasons that we don't see good restoration outcomes, along with lack of standardized accounting, so that it's very difficult to compare the benefits of different sites at a landscape scale. Finally, we rely on very rudimentary mechanisms for securing offset benefits, so conservation easements, purchase of land, and they can be costly, and also it's very difficult to obtain permanent benefits when landowners like to or prefer to maintain an option value for their land. And finally, I think we have to think about the different contested values that we have in our society when we think about what the values are that we're trying to restore or maintain with our offset policy. So the first question that we need to think of when we're thinking about offset options and whether we're achieving no net loss is compared to what? So this diagram shows us on the right-hand side a nice created wetland. It provides some function in terms of hydrologic storage, might be cycling nutrients, and it provides some human benefits. It's nice to look at, people can walk around it. And we compare this to another wetland. So this is a wetland, say, in some farmer field. There is little access, perhaps, for humans to enjoy this wetland. It has maybe higher biodiversity function than the created wetland, but some of the other functions like hydrologic storage and nutrient cycling might not be as valued in that position. And so the question is, which of these do we prefer on our landscape? And how would we credit these two different actions? Another challenge that we have to address is how we consider additionality. So additionality is the principle that the offset program should, or the offset benefits should arise from the program and should not be something that we would have done otherwise. And so we need to think about in terms of the baseline for reviewing the credit of that action, what is the counterfactual scenario? So are we thinking about returning sites as they were historically to some historic condition, or are we thinking about the benefits of that site relative to some business as usual trajectory in which we will have background loss of biodiversity and conversion of sites over time? And so this makes a big difference when we're evaluating an offset policy in determining whether we think the policy has achieved a net gain or a net loss. As I mentioned before, we need to be conscious of the timing of these benefits and how we maintain biodiversity as sites restore. The idea that we need to make sure that we're achieving benefits from our offset policy has led, I think, to a preference for restoration over avoided loss, because it's easy to see that restoration leads to an immediate benefit. So we have more habitat on paper than we had before we had the impact. Whereas with avoided loss, it's not clear that the site would have been lost in the first place. And so maybe we're just paying a landowner to do something that would have done anyhow. And so it's a lot easier to credit a restoration action and say that it's creating a benefit versus crediting avoided loss and not being sure whether a benefit was actually created. We also have to think about the site context for both restoration and avoided loss. And so when we're thinking about crediting preserving a site or crediting avoided loss, we want to think about the role of that site in the landscape. So does that maintaining a historic habitat provide connectivity? Is it essential for seeds for species that we're going to lose and have to be restored over time? So I think we need to think about sites within a landscape context and not just think about net gain and net loss at a site level. And finally, we need to make sure that our policies are not crowding out voluntary action. And so if people stop doing voluntary things to maintain habitat with the idea that they might get paid or rewarded for it through an industrial offset program, then we have leakage, or we lose things that we might have maintained otherwise without the offset program. So I just want to speak to a couple of behavioral considerations related to additionality. So the first is asymmetric information. And this is the reality that private landowners know the benefit of their site more than the regulator does. And so when we're trying to set our prices and our mitigation ratios, we don't actually know the probability that a site will be converted. And so we have to make some assumptions about that. We might be able to model it in an average level, but for a particular site, we don't know. Again, that makes it much easier to establish a counterfactual for restoration, that restoration probably wouldn't have taken place otherwise, and we know that we're creating an additional benefit when we have restoration. And so again, this kind of hardwires a preference for restoration over avoided loss into our policy, and that can have, I think, important implications for biodiversity over time. The next, I guess, policy issue that relates to behavior is credit stacking. And so a lot of people have been grappling with this idea of whether you should allow credit stacking on individual sites. So a landowner would be able to sell carbon credits or sell credits for water quality. And whether you can stack those all on one site is controversial, because perhaps the site would have been maintained with just a carbon credit or just a water quality credit. And so combining those two things doesn't lead to net benefit. Again, because of asymmetric information, it's hard to know what the opportunity cost is for specific sites. If we don't allow credit stacking, the risk is that we lose sites that are multifunctional because we're not willing to pay enough for the high-value multifunctional sites that we might want in our portfolio of offsets. Finally, there's considerations around permanence. We know that it's very difficult to get landowners to participate in programs where they have to sell pieces of their land or engage in an easement that's permanent. Landowners like to maintain option value over their land. There are similar challenges when government tries to set aside public lands for an offset. Again, we're binding the choices in perpetuity for future uses of that land, which raises both economic considerations as well as ethical considerations, in that what we're actually doing is binding the choice sets of future generations, restricting their opportunities for development by permanently setting aside land for conservation to enjoy benefits of development today. So I just want to go back to the accounting problem in relation to restoration versus avoided loss sites, and how timing of the benefits fits into the accounting issue. And so some of the reviews that have come out regarding the benefits of offsets have looked at short time frames for reviewing whether offsets achieve net gain. So this diagram shows us biodiversity benefits and comparing impacts versus offsets at 10-year intervals and 50-year intervals. And so let's say we're comparing two different offset options. We could restore or we could avoid loss. What we see is that we have a background business as usual trajectory of biodiversity loss of, say, 1% a year of this particular habitat type. So if we're evaluating our offset policy and we want to look at net gain over 10 years, under business as usual scenario 1, we can see that restoration gives us an apparent benefit of B. So the site's been allowed to evolve over 10 years. Perhaps we have some hydrologic function, some other functions restored, but we don't have the full carbon benefits or the full biodiversity benefits that we had either before the site was developed or compared to historic loss. But that's only an accounting benefit. The actual benefit is the restoration benefit but we have to subtract that loss from sites being converted. So the net restoration benefit is actually the area B minus A in year 10, because we will lose some of those sites that aren't protected. The benefit of avoided loss is A. It's simply what we've protected relative to what would have been lost. The only way that we can achieve net gain in 10 years is through some combination of avoided loss and restoration. And I think that in order to achieve net gain, both in the short run and the long run, we need to think about how we're accounting for losses and gains over time. Again, if we look at 50 years out, under the business as usual scenario, we see that area E, our avoided loss scenario, now gives us a full offset for that first impact. And indeed, the first impact has had time to recover, and it's less after 50 years. So when do we count the impacts? At year 0, at year 10, or at year 50? Even if we allow a site to restore after 50 years, there's no guarantee that we will be able to return our site to historic condition. So these are some of the issues that our panel is going to be speaking about today. So in conclusion, I would like to summarize that no net loss is actually a historical construct. And what we think about is a paper that came out by Urita et al. In 2020 has a nice summary. When we're thinking about no net loss, we need to explore critical questions about which historical, geophysical, or biological benchmarks are deemed desirable, and are they recoverable? If so, how do judgments include or exclude certain human and non-human actors from baseline settings? Do baselines and attendant notions of harm really mitigate or prevent environmental harm, or do they instead accelerate the commodified appropriation of the non-human world? What is the relationship between baselining the past and anticipating the future, particularly given the accelerated anthropogenic changes associated with the Anthropocene? And so with that, I would like to turn it over to our other panelists to share their ideas about no net loss. And anyone who would like copies of the papers that I've cited can send me an email afterwards. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fabien Quétier, and I will be presenting some real-world case studies of how offsets were designed and implemented to try and reflect on some of the issues that Marian presented, and hopefully this will be food for thought for the next steps.
And Fabien, we've posted your poll on the stage link, so if people would like to vote now, that we can share the poll results when you're ready.
So I work for a consulting firm called Biotope, based in France, and we have nearly 30 years of experience in biodiversity management in the context of development projects. And so we've been keeping track of how the expectations from projects in terms of biodiversity ecosystems have evolved over time. And so over the past decade, we've increasingly phrased those requirements and our solutions to our clients as no net loss. But looking at that from a more scientific angle, looking at it as a conservationist, and looking at it also from the point of view of public policy, this concept of no net loss really brings up very many questions, which I think it'll be very interesting for us to discuss. So let me start with an example, which was one of the first mega projects to actually claim to be achieving no net loss of biodiversity. And so this was over a decade ago, a large mine in Madagascar with actually some Canadian interests in the project. And if I, and of course this is a simplification, what happened to biodiversity in the context of that project, they had a 2,000 hectare footprint of native forest that was cleared for this project. They did some avoidance. Part of the resource was foregone, and some of the forest on the metal-rich soils was conserved as part of the project design. They, of course, are planning and doing some post-mining rehabilitation, trying to regrow forest on the mine site. But this isn't taken into account in the no net loss calculation, if you like. The main approach they used was to actually protect 10 times the area of forest that they were destroying as an offset, and using that to claim no net loss of biodiversity. And so I'd really like you to take a second and think about that, and whether or not you think that the overall balance here of a loss of 2,000 hectares of forest, some avoidance, and the protection of 20,000 hectares of existing forest, whether or not that actually qualifies as what you would call no net loss, or even better, a net gain. And remember, this is Madagascar, very valuable biodiversity from a global perspective, but also a very high rate of forest loss. So there isn't really a straightforward, and Marian explained quite well why. If I was to show this graphically, you could imagine that at the date of the Biotope project designing its offsets, there was a certain amount of forest remaining of natural habitat in the country. Within that habitat, some destruction was being allowed on the basis that it would be offset, for example, by protecting twice the area that was developed. And if you actually make that kind of arrangement into a public policy and generalize this 2-to-1 ratio, what you're actually basically accepting is the loss of 1/3 of the original habitat that you had when you started implementing this policy. So what seems like a significant offset, 2-to-1, is actually a form of accepted net loss, certainly relative to the starting point. And so this is a really important way of looking at this. And so what this says is that if you're simply protecting existing habitat, over time, this actually automatically leads to a net loss. What it also shows is that by looking at the area ratio, you're actually able to determine what is the overall loss that you are comfortable with. Now, this might not be explicit in policy decisions, but it certainly is when you look at this a little bit more analytically. And the same holds true if instead of creating new protected areas, you're actually making existing but ineffective protected areas more effective. So if you're addressing the paper parks issue, which in the context of Madagascar, you actually have how much habitat you have at the end and how much you've lost relative to when you started implementing this policy. Now, of course, if you think about Madagascar, there are many impacts on those forests that are not regulated and for which, in practice, there is neither avoidance nor offsetting. And so there are very many kinds of activities that lead to biodiversity losses that don't have to undergo an EIA process. Think about smallholder farming, hunting and poaching, and even the very basic necessity of fuel in some of these countries. So these are very important drivers of biodiversity loss. What does this change? Well, if you compare the situation on top, which I just explained, with the one at the bottom, you can add this kind of unregulated development or impact to the equation. And what you find is that actually these kinds of impacts, of course, increases the overall losses. But really, for this discussion today, what it shows is that when thinking of offsetting by averting losses caused by third parties, what you're actually comparing is a scenario with your offsets, with your averted loss offsets, to a scenario without any offsetting, where those unregulated impacts occur and cause this unregulated loss. And this is very important because it actually shows that if you're using averted loss, as Ambatovi did, to justify no net loss, it's because you're actually comparing what you're doing with a hypothetical scenario on the right, which ends up in purple, rather than comparing it with the baseline situation when you designed that particular offset. And it's important to have this in mind and to be explicit about your frame of reference against which you're actually defining no net loss. Now, an alternative, as Marian said, is to, rather than protect existing biodiversity, is to try and restore degraded biodiversity. And so there are a number of examples of this. I'll give you one from closer to home from me, from northern France. It was a coastal development on the shores of the North Sea that had impacts on shorebirds that needed to be offset. And so the offset was to actually take some farmland that historically had been expanded onto coastal marshes through drainage and filling. But in this case, it was intensive cultivation. And so this land was purchased and converted back into a coastal wetland, and actually designed, engineered, if you like, to maximize its value as breeding habitat for shorebirds. So it was quite intensive, but the end result was as designed, very successful from the birds. And so in this case, you could really say that biodiversity was very much created out of a very biodiverse piece of land. That restoration gains can be obtained. It can be more or less passive, as you know, when you are decreasing a particular pressure, say excessive grazing or poaching. But you can also be more active in your restoration, removing invasive species, reintroducing species that have locally disappeared, planting species of plants, for example. There are very many options for this. And so if I use the same set of diagrams to explain how this then plays out, well, you can imagine that if your starting point is a situation in which part of your habitat is in good condition, but part of it is degraded, in brown here, then you could require that any impacts caused to the natural habitat be offset through restoration. And so depending on how much restoration you require, you can actually, over time, indeed achieve no net loss at the landscape scale. And if you have a bigger area ratio, you could also make the case for a net gain. And this, here again, means no net loss or a net gain relative to the baseline initial conditions when that policy was started being implemented. And so here we have the same conclusions, that simply protecting existing habitat would only lead to a net loss, that the area ratio did the overall outcome, no net loss, or how much net gain. And so this might be the right time for you to look at the poll that was shared, because what kind of net gain is suitable is very debated, and it would be interesting to get everyone's views on what that might mean.
Okay,
and finally, of course, sorry?
So our poll results are large, +1 unit. We've got 45% of our people wanting that, but it's closely followed. We have 16% saying +50%. Oh, sorry, plus 100%. The poll is changing dynamically. So double the baseline is the second vote. So we've got 20 votes for +1, and then plus 100 gets 8 votes.
Okay, very interesting. I think it's maybe, and this is my interpretation live here, is that maybe some of the participants are rigorous in their use of words and their understanding, and so of course just one extra pair of breeding waders might counts as a net gain. It does make sense, and then others perhaps are thinking about what needs to be done to reach broader societal goals and actually restore maybe viable populations of that wader, and typically a much bigger effort is required than just +1. But we can discuss that later, I think. I want to mention of course, the word of water doesn't always make sense, and in the case of Madagascar, nature is something that a lot to do for a long time with limited success, and so it's important also to not believe all of the hype around restoration and draw the right conclusions from that. Now, as a European, I'm relatively lucky that a lot of the biodiversity that triggers offsetting in France, for example, is actually very much tied to traditional agricultural landscapes. And a lot of the conservation policy in a country like France is actually geared towards reinstating the kind of extensive, low impact, small scale farming systems that enable a lot of our current wildlife to exist and coexist with agricultural production for a long time. This, of course, is in a context where, if you go back further into history, most of those landscapes were actually forested. Most of them had much larger cohorts of much larger animals, which have gone extinct for centuries now. And so following the shifting baselines syndrome, people have forgotten about that. And so what they're using as their reference for what needs to be achieved and what is an acceptable outcome for the offsetting system is actually very much a modified and intensively used type of landscape if you compare that to the kind of things that would be expected in contexts like Australia, Africa, or South America. Another example of this is a railway line in southern France, where you can see it's on the picture on the left, it's crossing a mosaic of farmland, vineyards, agricultural fields, of course, a lot of villages and roads and infrastructure. But in that landscape, you can find species like the little bustard, this right, which is a species of bird that is near threatened globally, but heavily protected in the European Union, and that actually is found in a few places where you still have relatively extensive grasslands and fallows. We were able to determine habitat quality for that species at the landscape level and link this to the population dynamics of the species to maintain the overall carrying capacity of the landscape for this little bustard, in spite of the railway line being built across most of it, because of course the bird is found where there is less built up area, which is where you would put this new linear infrastructure project. So the outcome was that in this landscape, a great many little bits of land all over the agricultural landscape were either purchased or contracted. The farmers signed contracts to change the management of those agricultural parcels to make the vegetation more suitable for the species. And if you remember Marian's comment about crowding out and the landscape level effects, it's important to remember farmers are indeed very much able to sign a contract on a piece of their farm that they intended to put back into fallow anyway, get it paid for it, and at the same time convert another piece of land they had as fallow, for example, to a vineyard, thereby actually having no overall benefit for the species at the scale of their overall farm. And so that's the kind of thing that's very hard to incorporate into the offset design. I want also to mention something that I think France has pioneered in a way, certainly in Europe, which is a publicly accessible database of where all the offsets are. And so each parcel of land that actually carries an offset can be found and traced by the general public. And this is very useful in terms of overall monitoring and making sure that the offsetting doesn't stay between the developer and the permitting authority. And so this is something really that is a very interesting development. And my last point is about this landscape view of offsetting. And so when you look at this agricultural landscape with different types of land uses that are more or less favorable to a different species of interest, it would really make sense, rather than having a piecemeal approach where individual parcels of land and landowners get involved in offsetting, to be a little bit more strategic and to actively think about where avoidance, but mainly offsets, need to be located to achieve biodiversity goals at the landscape scale, such as changing farming systems so that they can accommodate much more biodiversity whilst still staying as productive land. There you go. I hope this was useful to showcase some real-world applications where the issues that we want to discuss play out, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for your presentation, Fabien. We do have some questions coming in. Most of them are pretty good grist for the panel discussion a little bit later, I think, but maybe I'll ask you one that is kind of fundamental, but I think seems to be a concern to our participants. Can you clarify, are regulators the only ones who can ensure that biodiversity offsets happen?
No, it really depends on the context. So the examples I gave from France typically are enforced by regulators, but regulators have only so much capacity to do that. And so they also, quite frankly, rely heavily on local NGOs to sound the alarm when offsets are not being complied with, or of course when development gets authorized without appropriate offsetting. And so that goes through it typically goes through the courts, where permitting decisions get challenged, or in case of non-compliance can of course go quite far in terms of penalties. But so that's I think is something that would work in most countries where regulators have that capacity. But the example in Madagascar, for example, and is most of the enforcement actually comes from financial institutions lending or investing in that particular project, having their own safeguards and standards, and a system of regular audits to go and check that the project remains compliant with those standards. And so that, sometimes is the only recourse. Of course, it's somewhat more fragile because you don't have all of the checks and balances that you might have in countries where regulators and courts and NGOs interact around a project.
Yeah, and of course we do have examples, including examples in Canada where companies have undertaken offsetting voluntarily in one form or another.
Oh yeah, okay, but sure. I was thinking about enforcement, and so
Well, yeah,
enforcing something voluntary is.
Yes, no, you're right, and the question did say ensure that they are done. So I think your interpretation is probably justified. Well, I think we're a little bit behind time on our schedules, so I think we'll thank you for your presentation, Fabien. Look forward to you joining us in the panel discussion later. And
Okay,
we
thank
will
you.
move to Florence.
Cool.
I'll get out of your way.
Hi, everybody, and good morning to the ones of you that are in Canada, and hi to everyone else who is also in the planet. So today I'm going to summarize for you a paper I co-authored with two of my colleagues at RMIT University, Anna Backstrom and Aslin Gordon. And the idea of this paper was to explore the timeframes involved when we talk about no-net loss. So I'm going to simplify a bit the key messages of our paper. For the whole complexity of it, you can send me an email and I will send you the paper. So basically, when we talk about no-net loss, we are basically assuming three things. First, we are assuming that we are able to produce biodiversity gains. And as my colleague said before, there are lots of challenges associated to that. On top of that, we are also assuming that we can actually maintain as long as the impacts remain. And we also assume that we are actually able to maintain these gains over the long term in perpetuity for long-term or irreversible impacts. And actually that's the case for many development projects, because simply development projects that generate offsets are to be impactful enough to require a permit and offset requirements under conservation legislation. If not, they wouldn't need to do offset, they wouldn't need a permit. And also because conservation legislations are by definition biased towards long-lived species such as mammals and also complex ecosystems, and that's why we protect them in the first place. So in many cases, actually, because impacts are going to be permanent or very long-term, then it means that we need to keep the gains over the long term or in perpetuity. And that's why best practice guidelines are recommending. And so what we wanted to do in this paper is because we noticed like in the guidelines, we talk a lot about long-term or perpetuity, but we don't really talk about, okay, what are we meaning exactly by that in terms of timeframes. So what we did was to look at the restoration literature to get an idea of, okay, how long does it take to restore different things as part of components of biodiversity? And so we came up with more or less the idea that short term, from an ecological point of view, what is short term is, let's say, less than 20 years. With that amount of years, you should be able to properly restore marine short-lived species, for example. So as you can see on this figure, there is the time and there are different components of biodiversity. So short term, you could have, for example, short-lived organisms that live in the sea. Medium term would be between 20 years and 100 years, and with a done time frame, based on the literature, you should be able to properly recover populations of terrestrial mid-lived species, such as some species of falcons. On the long term, 100, 300 years, you can restore normally marine complex ecosystems. And then beyond, we define it beyond 100 years, 300 years, sorry, as being in perpetuity. And that's where you tap into very complex woodlands that actually requires hundreds of years, up to thousands of years, in order to be restored. So I'm basically dealing with these timescales when we talk about restoration of specific components of biodiversity from short to long term. And this has a lot of implication from an institutional point of view. So in this figure, what you see is the time in terms of years. So now we are in the year 2020, so we are approximately in the middle of the figure. And what we did with this graph was to show, okay, if we take short-term, medium, long, and perpetuity time scale, which are in greens here, what does that mean in terms of other things? Basically, it means the timeline problems that we are going to continue recruit gains in some cases and having to retain gains while the projects of like the damaged West Coast, the project happened and even the lifespan of the project is over. So in orange here, it's a few examples of quite long like projects with long lifespans, such as big infrastructure projects or mining projects. And you can see that they die out and they stop existing before potentially gains are fully recruited. It also means starting thinking about, okay, we need to keep the gains at time frames that are much longer than what current offset policies are thinking, which are represented here in red, and I'm going to expand on that after. And it's also meaning to start tapping into historical timescales. So when you think about 200, 250 years, that's what is separating us from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So when we talk about 2000 years, it's the beginning of Christianity. If we talk about, let's say, 70 years, like we start tapping into when really the field of conservation started really developing itself in the Western world. So we're dealing with historical timescale where institutions are going to change, which is a bit overwhelming, and that's what the whole idea of this paper was, to grapple with these a bit scary temporal timescales. So basically, the literature and policies have already started grappled with this notion of long-term and how we can start thinking about it a little bit. So we looked at offset policies, and in offset policies, you really came to the conclusion that at the moment, current offset policies, they follow policy cycles and absolutely not ecological timeframes. So the mindset is really more or less, when we talk about timeframes, anything beyond 30, 50 years is really long term. So active management phases in the offset policies we have reviewed. So we focused on some Europeans, Australian ones, and in the US. Active management phases, it's around 10, 30 years, which actually correspond to very short-term timescales in terms of ecological timeframes, sorry. We found that retainment phases, so when you keep your gains, more or less they go up to 50 years maximum in practice when they are included in the policy. And basically, more or less, there is little to no planning beyond 50 years, which is already seen as, in a long time. Best practice guidelines I've also discussed about this question of timeframes, but still have a bit of an horizon that is a bit similar and don't really think beyond, or at least in terms of more than a few decades or centuries. But what they did was to try to provide some guidance to improve at least how we can secure the gains during that period. And so what they recommend is to secure the land ownership legally, so or by adding the offset site into a network of protected areas, or through a covenants or permanent easements, as was already mentioned before. They also said that we need to better secure the management, so try to expand the duration of the adaptive management plans, ensure that monitoring is going to happen through time. And the most innovative bit in the best practice guidelines is this idea that we need to secure payment for services. So basically that actually we are going to have to pay people for longer than what we previously discussed, and need to find ways to secure capitals, secure safeguards for risks if there are any ecological or financial failures, and also having some monitoring in place for also monitoring the budgets, etc., through, for example, a trust fund. So we've got the details of that in our paper, but I won't have the time to explain all these different tools in details for now. What we also did in our work was to actually think about these best practice guidelines and the current propositions, and we highlighted some limitations to that. So from a governance point of view, there is a quite big problem of additionality and both intragenerational justice and intergenerational justice. So in the current generation, as mentioned, like Fabien was mentioning before, actually in reality, there is a lot of reliance on conservation NGOs and also public authorities to do a lot of work, often related to controlling, researching, and doing some stewardships of the offset sites to ensure that gains are going to stay across time. But this has a cost, and if there is not additional money put into place for that, then it means that basically instead of doing conservation, the state and the civil society are going to spend some of their time doing some offsetting work. So these costs are not included. And same the long-term cost, if we go beyond a few years or a few decades, these long-term costs of both recruiting and retaining the gains are not being included, which are also causing some additionality issue and intergenerational justice issues. Lastly, in terms of governance, the problem is that all the tools that are currently suggested in the best practice literature really takes our current political economic system as given. So basically capitalism and the structure of the state. And this system, while seeming strong today, it's actually going to transform itself through time or disappear, because that's how history works, like institutions come and go. And it's also for the tools to work, you need the financial system, the capitalist system, and the state to be stable. And we know that with the Anthropocene, shocks are going to come, creating instabilities in the system. So actually the tools are quite fragile in front of the coming shocks of the Anthropocene. In terms of ecology, basically at the moment, the management timeframes, they don't really are not specified depending on the ecological needs of the different gains to be recruited, and they are going to differ. Maybe some gains only require a few years or a few decades, and others are going to require much more time, and this is not really being discussed. Same if we talk about more than decades and we start entering into centuries, we tap into evolutionary processes, and Eric is probably going to mention some of these aspects, and this is not being discussed either in the literature or in policies. And we also know that there are going to be more and more pressures on natural resources because of the Anthropocene. It's already affecting protected areas, and it's highly likely that offset sites are going to be subject to these pressures, and nothing is really thought at the moment to deal with that. So that's a bit overwhelming, but basically doing non-net loss, if we are serious about doing non-net loss, we have to think about these questions. We have also suggested a few ways to try to move forwards from there. In terms of additionality and justice, we recommended that the control, research, and stewardship costs, both for the current generation and the future ones, if any, need to be internalized when we are estimating the offsets costs. And this might seem really demanding, but actually it's what is already happening in other sectors. So for example, the nuclear energy sector is already internalizing in the cost of electricity today in some contexts, the cost of doing research on how to manage the waste, or or the cost of managing the waste over the long term. So these are tools that already exist. Another point that is important is that all this is only going to work if we actually build institutions that are going to first prioritize renouncement and avoidance, and that are going to make sure that if the damage is being authorized, that the polluters are actually going to pay the full cost of offsetting. If not, it means that they are just pushing the cost on others, or the conservation field, or partially the conservation field, or future generations. And if the cost is too high, and it means that simply the project is too costly. We also recommended that offset policies really need to start incorporating multi-decadal and century plus time frames within the policies, and start thinking at these time scales. They need to start building and think about how we can build the long-term social ecological resilience and stewardship of offset sites. And doing so means to basically engage with the dynamic nature of future gains in the Anthropocene, and also it means to work with local stakeholders and their both formal and informal systems of governance to ensure long-term stewardship. And on this, I can only highlight that in Canada in particular, with Indigenous peoples and the traditional owners, there are plenty of existing systems of governance that are much better wired to think about long-term than current Western institutions of the modern states as we understand it today. And if all what I've said sounds overwhelming and not easy, that's absolutely normal. The modern Western system of governance is not made, and it's not built to deal with long-term consequences of present impacts. And that's why it's so difficult to think about all these questions today. So thank you. And next is going to be Eric, and I'm looking forward to discussing together in our discussion.
Thanks, Florence. That was great. Yes, I think it's at this time probably prudent to hold all our questions till we have the full panel assembled. So I'll ask Eric to join us and give us the benefit of his presentation. Hi, Eric. Thank you.
Hi, Dave. Thanks very much, and thanks, Florence and Marian and Fabien. I come to you this morning from the unceded traditional territories of the Songhees First Nation in what is now Victoria, British Columbia. So what I'm really appreciating about this session is the insight that I had when I first got into restoration as a student back in the 80s, is that so many of the challenges we face with ecological restoration, and especially when we start talking about offsets and no net loss, is that it's not even clear that we have the moral enzymes to digest the problems that we're confronting. And I think that came up really clearly in Florence's presentation. I also think that we put a lot on restoration. You know, if restoration were a superhero, I think we'd still be looking for the magic cape. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. Next slide, please, Kathleen. Great. So I spent a lot of my time in the last 20 years in particular staring at images of change in mountain landscapes. Through work I do with something called the Mountain Legacy Project, I take away several lessons from staring at the dynamics of change. First is that the past really does matter. Continuity matters. Kathleen, if you could click the slide. The second lesson is that ecosystems are dynamic and adaptive, but it seems that someone's really turned up the dial on the change. And the third lesson is that cultural legacies really matter. Next slide. So just a quick commercial plug, non-commercial plug, I guess, for the Mountain Legacy Project, which is a long-term research project looking at landscape change in Canadian mountains. So I'm not going to talk any more about that, although it's fun to do it. I'm going to get on to restoration. Next slide, please. So spending time looking at historical change and trying to understand the dynamics of how historical change sets up restoration. Here we are. We just entered a United Nations decade on ecosystem restoration. And for those of us who have been working on restoration for a number of years, this is an amazing development. So we've looked at years, and now suddenly we're out in front. And it's a very daunting challenge because the ambitions are enormous in terms of scaling up and trying to do more with restoration, which is, and I spent a lot more time talking about, well, what the science is that we don't have to be able to make some of these decisions. Next slide, please. So many of us know I don't have a good gauge of the audience and how much experience you have with restoration, but let's go back to basics. This is the durable and persistent definition of ecological restoration that we've had. The process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's damaged, degraded, or destroyed. And that comes to us from the Society for Ecological Restoration. Next slide, please. We spent a lot of time over the last 3 decades thinking about how to make restoration operational, how to define it, how to come up with clear principles and guidelines and best practices that tell us how we should do it well. This is one of my favorite models for restoration. This is from a 2015 article led by Katie Suding at the University of Colorado. And it argues that there are 4 key components to restoration. And each of these have to be in place. Each and every one of them needs to be in place to be doing good restoration. And it places a pretty big premium on restoration. On what we need to do to make it work. So we need to have ecological integrity. We need to, however that's defined, that's complicated in itself. We need to know that these systems are going to be sustainable over the long term. They need to be informed not only by the past, and if you don't mind going back, sorry. Great. They need to be informed by the past and the future. And this important one that's coming to the fore more and more is it needs to benefit and engage society. So these are the elements that are part of the core principles of restoration. I think they work pretty well. Next slide, please. So restoration's under tremendous pressure right now, though. You know, here we've created a UN decade, but if you can click through some of these for me, please. So we have increased novelty, poverty alleviation, sustainable livelihood demands, historical qualities. We're being asked to scale up. There's aesthetic dimensions. Keep going. There's threatened species. And finally, evolving cultural values. This is probably not a comprehensive or complete list, but it gives you a sense that there's a lot on restoration. Keep clicking, please. And so it actually makes one wonder whether restoration is capable of dealing with all that change. So there's been lots of different attempts. Here's one that colleagues and I developed in 2014, saying that maybe restoration needs to shift. Maybe it needs to go from an older view, a 1.0 view of restoration, where history really served as a template. We only had singular trajectories and we emphasized composition, to a new type of restoration where history is a guide and there's multiple trajectories. We emphasize process and we really look at pragmatic goals for livelihood needs. Next slide, please. Increasingly though, and I just touched down briefly on novel ecosystems, is that here's a photograph. Actually, this is really apropos of the moment that we're in right now, spring here in Victoria, where that blue flower, which is giant camas, a highly prized cultural species and native ecological species that has a lot of important roles in the ecosystem, is backed by a pretty aggressive invasive species, Scotch broom. And this kind of typifies for me a lot of what we're seeing in ecosystems now, where we have this intermix of native and invasive or exotic species, and it's creating complexities. I call this a hybrid ecosystem. Next slide, please. And then we're seeing also this continuous push on both the functional and compositional attributes of ecosystems, create these novel ecosystems, which are defined as differences in ecosystem composition, structure, or function, thresholds that make them practically unrestorable, and third, that they're persistent or self-organized. So there's a lot of misunderstanding of novel ecosystems, but they must satisfy these criteria. So they're practically unrestorable because they're intermixed species that we've never seen before. These are ecosystems that we just don't have any record of. They're non-analog, and we can't restore them very easily, but they're ecosystems. So if I can, next slide, please. So if we return to this slide about pressure, we're actually seeing a lot of countervailing things happening now with restoration as well. And this is the other dynamic I wanted to mention about what's going on with restoration. So I mentioned the pressures before. We also have a lot of cool things going on. I didn't put offsets on this list, but we have species reintroduction or rewilding, reclamation, bionovelty, forest landscape restoration, ecological design, and one more click, please, Kathleen. And it starts to create this condition where we might think of restoration as comprising a whole bunch of different practices. Next slide, please. And it makes us ask this question about how big the restoration tent really is. Apparently, by the way, this is the world's largest portable tent. It's kind of cool. But this question of, what is, what does restoration encompass, and how does it hold on to some of those core principles that I spoke of earlier? The principles of ecological integrity, informed by the past and the future, engaging society, and ensuring that they're long-term and sustainable. I'm going to leave it there. And turn it back.
So we've got a lot of questions coming in. I don't expect we'll get to all of them, but maybe I'll try and synthesize some of the main themes. Fabien, you seem to attract a lot of people's attention when you commented on the role of traditional agriculture in preserving biodiversity in France. And we've got a couple of questions about, does our sort of more traditional use of the landscape offer a nature-friendly middle ground between the industrial heavily impact on the landscape and the more pristine environments that we may seek to put in place through offsetting or preserve through averted loss. And maybe I'd like to hear your comments on that, but I think I'd love to hear Eric's as well, and anybody else that would care to chime in on that. Fabien, do you want to?
Should I go first or Eric?
Why don't you go first? And your audio is a little crackly, a lot crackly, actually. So I don't know if you can adjust anything there. Maybe I'll ask Eric to field that while
Sure.
you take a look at that. Thanks.
Sure. I had experience recently, Dave, in the Netherlands. I lived there for a year, and I worked at the University of Groningen in the north of the Netherlands with a group of people who were doing very creative work on what they called nature-friendly, restoration and, nature-friendly rewilding. And they were working with agricultural systems and trying to improve biodiversity measures in those agricultural systems. It's great. But my sort of underlying concern, maybe this goes back to some of what Marian was saying, is that we create these new norms, right? So we live in a landscape in which we are normed by what we exist in. And I worry about the bigger losses to historical continuity and, widespread biodiversity if we start seeing that kind of intermediate type of intervention as being the new norm. I'll start there.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Fabien, let's try you again. You are muted.
Okay, is it better now? Does this work?
We can understand you, so carry on.
Okay, I think the main point that I would draw from the European experience is that it totally ignores the concept of ecological integrity and the concept of having an original ecosystem prior to industrial land uses. It is a historical reference. It's basically the reference from the mid 20th century. But it doesn't really tackle the issue of ecological integrity. Instead, it's the target biodiversity is totally a societal construct. And in that respect, if the societal construct is the biodiversity we want is the one that is in this particular kind of agricultural landscape, and that's what is used as a reference for the whole policy design and implementation.
Okay. Florence, Marian, did you want to chime in on this?
Sure. Yeah, just to bring some precision, because I had the chance of comparing the French context and the Australian context in my research. It's basically relating to fundamental narratives about the representations of nature in both contexts. And you have, at least I would talk for Australia, an imaginary of nature as wilderness that is related to you know, the history of colonization in that country, for example. It's the same for the New World in general. And also that because of its sudden colonization by Europeans, not such a long time ago, there has been a lot of disturbances, extreme disturbances in the ecosystem, and a lot.
Well, I don't know if Florence has gone silent for everybody else. I gather yes. So maybe Florence, while you work that out, we can see if we can look at another couple of questions here. There's a few policy questions that people have offered, kind of separate from the technical questions that we've been dealing with today. And a lot of them revolve around the cost of offsetting and the equity of sharing that cost. You know, asking questions of whether this is simply an additional cost for industry, whether that is a cost that is appropriately borne by the individual proponents, and whether we should be looking to limit the degree to which those costs are borne by proponents. Florence,
Yeah.
just yeah, okay, you're back.
But I know what you had. It's okay. We can move to the next question. I got removed from the session. That's fine.
Well, I was just saying that there seems to be a number of questions, in part stimulated by your presentation about setting up appropriate financial mechanisms for offsetting, as to whether this becomes an unreasonable cost to impose on industry, and whether industry is the appropriate body to bear that cost. Do you want to take that on?
Yeah, sure. So often actually, like often large projects, they can be led by private entities, but they are also often public and public-private partnerships. So for example, if you think about roads, if you think about train lines, it can actually be a public entity. So the polluter in that case, the polluter pay principle, actually the polluter would be the state. And at the end of the day, like when we talk about offsetting, and the notion of offsetting is all about internalizing some of the costs of destroying biodiversity. And of course, it's at the center of the tension where we have development happening, and there are planetary boundaries. And if we start internalizing the costs that we are currently not paying, then of course the bill is becoming much higher, and is tapping into questioning our current ways of developing and the costs we inflict on ecosystems and future generation. And of course, this leads to the central tension that we have nowadays, where there are like our interests to develop, and then there are the consequences it has. So it's no surprise that there would be some tension around what is a legitimate project. And if we start internalizing the whole cost of actually doing offsetting and considering the long-term consequences and costs for over decades or centuries, then suddenly a lot of projects that are feasible are not feasible anymore when you think about future costs. And that's a societal discussions to have. What is a project that is actually essential and acceptable?
Great, thank you. Would anybody else like to offer any comments on that? Marian, you're our economist.
I guess I would just add that I think that regulatory offsets are really a way of generating some of that investment money needed for restoration. So we have a huge need to restore our landscapes from historic loss, and we've been using offsets as a way to do that and to get industry to pay for that and account for their impacts going forward. So there is a polluter pay principle, I think, that's valid. And I think the discussion of the combination of public pay versus industry is something that needs to be on the table.
Okay, a question for the whole panel. Does restoration stop at the city-urban boundary and only non-urban landowners, and put only landowners or non-urban landowners at risk? Okay, Eric, you seem to have an opinion on this.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think some of the most exciting and innovative work and restorations going on in urban regions.
We certainly, I think, see an increasing emphasis on the importance of urban biodiversity to preserve all
Sure.
sorts of aspects of our biota. So, okay. So just we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'll throw this out here. In a developing country, we can still create norms to improve management. But it's still complicated to include offsets in the list of conservation opportunities. How can we change that? And I would say, I would even remove the in developing countries limitation on that. How can we make offsetting a bigger part of our conservation action mix? Eric.
Well, just take us out. This idea has been emerging for me this morning really clearly in the discussions, is that offsetting doesn't really work well unless you've got a broader civil society agreement on what it is that you're trying to achieve beyond offsetting. And I don't think in many cases we have that. And so I think people will trust offsetting as soon as we have not just strong industrial guidelines and ways in which there's best practices there, and we have strong governmental oversight, but we have to have this broader appreciation of what we're trying to get to. You know, it's that without that, I just don't see it being as strong as it needs to be.
I think that's coming through as a dominant theme in our series already after 2 sessions here. So, okay, well, we're just about out of time, so I think I hate to cut off the questions. We've got many good questions, but perhaps people can hold them for the discussion sessions that we're going to be going into. And at this point, I would simply ask, thank you to all our speakers. I know Fabien and Florence are going to stick around for the smaller group discussions. I believe Marian's going to be floating between those discussions. And Eric, you're certainly, we would love to see you stick around, but I don't think you're able to.
I'm sorry I can't, but it's been really great to be part of this today. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So, I'd like to make a few closing comments and give you instructions to stay with us and join in those smaller group discussions on today's topic, and also to request your feedback and assistance in presenting the coming sessions in this series. First of all, I'd like to thank all of today's speakers for getting our series off to a very interesting and engaging start. Many thanks to Marian, Fabien, Florence, and Eric. Secondly, I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors, Alberta Innovates, the Government of Canada Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, ConocoPhillips Canada, and Tech. Finally, if you've not already done so, I encourage you to check out and register for the remaining sessions in this 8-part series. A week today, we'll be focusing on the topic Beyond Multipliers, Managing the Risks of Offsetting, with Joe Bull, Marcus Eyre, Karen Stefanik, and Amrai Van Hassa.